Today, I hope to learn from you about two things. One is how to build cross border businesses, and second is when a consumer is making a life changing decision, how do you leverage that opportunity?
What we're trying to build is a generational company, right? We're trying to build the future of how human mobility happens on the planet.
Avinav Nigam is the co-founder of IMMO Capital, which manages $2 billion in real estate assets, and now the founder of TERN Group, an AI-native platform helping Indian talent find jobs overseas.
We manage around a couple of $1 billion now in assets across Europe, working with some of the largest investors on the planet.
Aren't you doing too much for a 24-month-old company? Avinav, welcome to the Founder Thesis podcast. Today, I hope to learn from you about two things. One is how to build cross-border businesses, and second is when a consumer is making a life-changing decision, how do you leverage that opportunity? Why are you the right person to teach me this?
No, thank you, Akshay. Super excited to be here, first of all, and really thank you for having me. Look, I have this is probably the third company I'm building now in this space. One in the car space, to be able to buy a used car or a car for an aspiring Indian middle class person is a life changing decision. It's a very hard, very difficult decision. It can often be a year, 2 years, 5 years in the making. Same thing about buying a house, tends to be an extremely complex, very challenging decision as well. And moving countries for a job, it's probably one of the most harrowing experience I've been through as well, and learned through. So I've built companies in each of these three. I've as a total enterprise value, my companies have grown over $10 billion. So there's a lot to, hopefully, a little bit to learn from myself. It's always a new learning, but hopefully some things I can share.
Amazing. Let's begin. Take me through the journey first. What was the first venture that you built, and how did you end up over there?
Of course, I will bore you a little bit with background as well. I think because it all connects back to why I built things and what I've built. As a confused Indian kid, I grew up between the UK and India. My father was also the head of Indian Railways, so head of HR, sorry, for the Indian Railways. So I've seen large public sector workforce systems. I've sort of migrated 9 times. I've sort of moved within the country. I've lived in Assam, I've lived in Chennai, I've lived in Gujarat, I've lived in Delhi, in Bhavnagar, small towns, Vadodara. Lived everywhere. I've lived in 90s Manchester, which was very very rough, if you will. I've seen 2 cars being stolen in front of my eyes. For dad running after them. I've seen a lot of very interesting things. But I then went to IIT in Bombay to do my engineering. Studied chemical, and then took my first job. As crazy as it sounds, my first job in rural Japan. So I started with a company called Procter & Gamble, which is an American MNC, but they obviously had a big Japan business. I went into a production plant with 300 Japanese people and 1 Indian guy. So that was my life.
And Japan is very hard for people who don't know the language. And I'm sure you didn't have Google Translate back then.
There was nothing there. There was no AI. There was no live translation. Nothing. So it's one of the most challenging but most enriching experiences of my life. I think to be able to really integrate and assimilate and learn the language. I speak Japanese fluently now. For several years it was useful, and then it was not useful, and it's useful again. I'll explain why. As part of building TERN, it's become useful again. So I spent several years in Japan and then Singapore. I ran the Asia business for Procter & Gamble in detergents, so Ariel, the brand. Ran that out of Singapore. Then moved back to India to build companies. So this is sort of comes to the first one. So joined friends of mine that were building out this company in India in the car space. So essentially, the model was it's a C2B model. So the company is called Cars24. It's sort of been around the block, if you will. The company has obviously done exceptionally well, continues to do well. Really big believer in the mission. But it's a C2B model. Essentially, you've got a fragmented supply pool of people looking to sell their used cars. It's a very difficult transaction because buying and selling a used car or a car in India, you save up a lot of money. You're moving from scooters and to cars, and it's really a representative of the Indian economy and the coming of the middle class. So they would sell, but to be able to sell a car, you go to a dealer, and there's a lot of complexity in the documentation. There's a lot of belief or distrust, rather, that somebody's taking advantage of me for the price. There's a lot of the duration tends to be very long as well, the RC transfer and so on. So there's a lot of these similar challenges you'll notice across the three companies that I've built. And then once we've bought the car from them, we sort of sell it on to car dealers or car companies. So it's an instant transaction for something that could be extremely stressful for a family to be doing. So the business obviously took off massively. I was there until we were doing around 250 million revenues from zero. I remember the time sort of in a Gurgaon petrol pump, we had the first store, and we would go up to people trying to fill their petrol and ask them if they wanted to sell their car, and they would look at us like, "Are you stupid?" Like, or they would look at us and think, "Are you trying to steal my car from me?" Like, so that is the moment where it all started, and today obviously across 600 locations. Across the world, India, Australia, Southeast Asia, Middle East. So it's a phenomenal journey, lots of learning for myself personally as well.
This is like a marketplace, and you have been building marketplaces since then. Uh, is this marketplace different from, say, a Flipkart, which is selling products, versus this marketplace, which is first buying from consumers, and the sale might be happening in bulk also? I don't know whom the sale happens to, but does it have different characteristics?
Oh, very different. I'm glad you pointed that out. You've actually hit the nail on the head, right? So there's three broad differences, I would argue, versus a typical retail marketplace, or if you will, even a food marketplace and labor marketplaces in hyperlocal. So the key differences are, I think, number one is, as you mentioned, in our case, what we're doing is we realized that the biggest constraint in this category is supply. So the one company that controls the supply, or the one player that's able to aggregate and consolidate the supply, is the player that will win the category, right? So essentially the supply is coming from a very fragmented universe of sellers. So the first thing we had to change was the psychology for the customer, saying every brand is coming to me and saying, "Hey, buy this from me. Hey, buy that from me. Hey, use this of mine." But what we had to end up doing was essentially reverse the psychology for the customer to say, "Hey, why don't you sell us your car?" Right? It's not just an odd transaction in the sense that a company is asking you to sell. It's also a very big life decision. Right? So the second thing that tends to happen in these categories is what we call latent demand or latent supply. Right? So there could be 15 months before the actual transaction happening, the customer has started to think about selling or getting rid of their car. And the reason would be some issue pops up. The mechanic says you need to change, this particular piece in the engine, or there's a little bit of a bump, or it's crossed that 4-year mark where the price starts to drop, right? So that's when you want to get rid of it. So there's a lot of these factors that start to creep in, or a life stage change happens, et cetera, right? That's the second thing, is the latest. So you need to almost tap into the consumer psychology almost 12 to 18 months before that actual transaction happens. So think of it a very long lead time into the final conversion. So the funnel is super, in that way, slow, but also super important for you to be present in those moments. That's, I guess, the second difference in the characteristic. The third difference is that the dynamic on the consumer side is very different from the dynamic on the C to B side. So we had a consumer side, we had a business side. On the business side, what they were looking for, these are car dealers or fleet companies or rental companies, et cetera, that were looking to buy. For them, their biggest pain point was that I now have a limited amount of space and limited amount of working capital, right? So if you are able to find a car for me, but I have a lot of buyers for those cars. If you are able to, on my phone, give me access to an infinite amount of inventory, an infinite amount of supply, suddenly I can immediately sell a car to somebody who walks through the door, because I am guaranteed on the back end that there will be supply to sell, without creating a crazy amount of working capital problems for me, which is the biggest issue in Indian SMB, right? So you're solving two very different problems. The third piece, which is probably similar to retail, in some ways is obviously inventory management tends to be one of the biggest success factors in this. So if you're holding stock as Cars24 for a long enough period of time, the asset is a depreciating asset. It's not an appreciating asset. So you also want to really tune down the model to be minimal. Similarly, in retail, you also have shelf life of products, but I guess the reverse reason for it. Here, the car's not necessarily dying, but maybe it's dying. It's depreciating. So I guess there's a few differences, but a couple of similarities as well. Transaction size is larger. There's a lot of post-transaction work as well in this category, right? So once the transaction is done, there's the RC transfer, documentation, insurance, all of that needs to happen. So I would argue a lot more diligence and a lot more documentation heavy as categories compared to, let's say, buying a shoe on Flipkart, right? So those are, I would say, the few differences versus the two marketplaces.
Okay, interesting. Correct me if I'm wrong. So Spinny would be selling more to consumers. That's why, for example, they would invest in Sachin Tendulkar as a brand ambassador, not to get more supply, but to get more demand, get more buyers in. So their model is fundamentally different. Like Cars24 would be selling more to dealers, cab companies, and so on.
Yeah, so I would say, and without sharing sort of exact data, I'm not privileged to share that much information. But it started, as I said, when I was there as a C2B model. I think we very quickly expanded into a C2C model as well. So essentially, because the stock was available, because you had access to probably the most constrained part of the sector, which was supply, you essentially then started to create the C2C brand as well, and that I think has also gone exceptionally well. From that point on. So in a way, I would say Spinny and Cars would be in a similar space. I do believe the one that will control the supply will control the category, and at this point, does seem like Cars24 is doing really well there.
Okay, interesting. So here, like supply decides who wins in this kind of a. This is a characteristic of, I guess, all secondhand kind of marketplaces, right? Like say phones and so on as well. Though none of the other spaces, I don't think they are investing in selling to consumers that much. Like say Cashify also, which is into secondhand phones, they sell to dealers, and a lot of other such companies in the secondhand phone market are more focused on supply. Like supply is where they're fighting rather than building demand.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think it really depends on how you see these sectors evolve, right? So, I have the luxury of being able to see this globally, right? So, I'm sitting in London, sort of in Dubai, in the US. So I can, there's a few examples of, so for example, you mentioned Cashify. There's a company called Back Market in Europe that has actually built out a supply first play in gadgets, largely phones and laptops and the likes, and smartwatches. They've sort of now pivoted, or rather, they're now for the first, I would say, 4 to 5 years of the journey, their entire focus was supply building and then selling to resellers. And now the majority of their focus is actually on going into C2C as well. So they're selling back to the consumer as well. So I think it really depends on when you feel you've got enough of a flywheel around supply building and capacity, and you've created a brand of a trusted buyer. That is when I think you actually have the halo that you can use towards the C2C side as well. I think it's a bit challenging to build two-sided consumer brands for categories that have infrequent transaction cycles. So I think you need to build one brand, and the choice in this case usually tends to be supply first. Once that's built, you can use the halo, you can use the similar marketing dollars to build the C2C sales, the selling side as well, back to the consumer, because the CAC obviously is a bit higher than acquiring businesses that are doing reselling. So I think that's where I think it's a natural evolution. So I'm sure it'll happen as well at the right point.
Interesting. Very interesting. Are these businesses typically holding the inventory on their books, or is it just pass through?
So this is very interesting. So what you mentioned is very interesting. I think back in the day, what we essentially built, and I'm pretty sure it still continues with cars as well, is this live auction model. And what it does is while you're sitting in the store sipping chai, your car data, is almost 140 plus data points that will get captured digitally video, everything, the onboard OBD from the car as well. Everything would electrical would get captured and then published into an automated report. Now I think we're using a lot more AI as well to assess damage and understand real issues. While you're sipping chai, the auction platform has already kicked off. Right? So essentially, the system already knows and is able to predict with a very high degree of certainty at what price that car is going to get sold at. And at the time I was part of Cars24, fortunately, we were able to also have an auction board where the sale would have already gone through, right? So a pre-sale would have gone through, so you knew the first 5 people out of thousands of dealers that wanted to buy the car. And I think that gave you a certain amount of assurance that the car was essentially sold before it was bought. So I think going down from several months of inventory, that is true in this case for any traditional car dealer, down to days and almost being instant. I think that was really the way to win. Because working capital is heavy, right? This is a big amount of investment per transaction is quite large. So if you can bring it down to an instantaneous transaction, the more you have the likelihood of winning.
So there is also an element of some vehicles giving you better margins because you're able to bring them close to a new car, whereas other vehicles, you can never bring them close to a new car, so those will have poorer margins.
Exactly. There's a bunch of factors, right? There's like in our real estate business also, there was like we were tracking almost 250 variables on pricing for assets. In cars as well, there's, as mentioned, over 140 variables. I think there's a few big ones, right? So the brand tends to be important. There's certain residual value of brands continues to be in India and globally actually. There tends to be certain models within that brand that do better. Then there's certain years, as I mentioned, once it's beyond 4 years, the price drop tends to be more significant because that's where typically people find issues cropping up, and the insurance sort of runs out, and then people don't really renew, and so things sort of change. Beyond that 4-year or 7-year warranty, that's the period you want to be mindful of. Then other factors tend to be the mileage, how much has it actually been driven, has it been in any serious accident or not, like etc. Right? So I would say those tend to be, and then as I said, unfortunately, because consumers we're very emotional buyers, the cosmetics do make a difference. That's what I would argue people should look past and actually look at the bones need to be good, right? If that makes sense.
What did you do next?
Amazing. So look, I post the cars journey, which was phenomenal. Really enjoyed myself. Really, built out, I think, hopefully a brand that endures for generations. We after the birth of our first child, we moved back to the UK. So I set up my next company in a very similar C2B model. So essentially, a fragmented supply in real estate, so housing, residential real estate. And we were working with institutions like private equity, family offices, insurance companies, pension funds, basically socially responsible investors that were looking to invest into European real estate at scale and create
residential or commercial?
Residential. So the pain point there, it's largely residential. The pain point there was, unlike markets like India or Dubai, where there's a lot of construction development happening, a lot of the cities have grown organically in places like Germany, Spain, the UK, where we were operating. And there's very little housing stock you have access to, right, as an investor. And more so, it's very attractive because this is one of the lowest beta, which is risk asset classes, and one of the highest alpha, right, return asset classes. So I think risk adjusted returns, this is probably at par with or close to equities across all asset groups, which is why it's an extremely interesting investment. But the challenge is the US has created this asset class called SFR, single family residential, but Europe had not. So essentially that's what we set out to build, was to create a new asset class in housing, allowing large institutions to deploy capital into residential real estate at low return but long-term holds, which is what creates a very favorable economy, right? You're not trying to unlock crazy returns like in Airbnb style housing, right? So it's long-term and it's investing into the middle class. It's making sure people have access to better opportunity, a better standard of living, and so on. That's what we are building. So again, a C2B model, very similar. Again, very similar characteristics of the category. It's the one of the biggest decisions of your life is to buy or sell a house. It is a complex documentation, legals. It's a long lead time, often even more than 3 to 5 years sometimes in planning. And there's a lot of trust deficit, like the car sector, because you don't trust brokers. I don't trust brokers, right? Personally. I'm sure a lot of people would agree. So what we essentially built was instantly able for consumers to sell their properties to us at good market pricing. We do a sort of evaluation, it'd be an instant offer. And then they don't have to take care of any of the paperwork, the legals, the hassle, the payment, the documentation. Everything was taken care of. So that business is called IMMO Capital, IMMO. IMMO largely means real estate in lots of European languages. As you remember, I grew up between the UK and India, so for me this was sort of going back. My wife also grew up between Germany and India, so for us it's always been one of the things that we knew we would do at the right point. But we obviously had large setup in India, as a smart entrepreneur would, to get access to the highest quality talent you possibly can, which the Indian ecosystem offers. So built out the business over several years. Again, similar to cars, sort of a good outcome. We manage around a couple of $1 billion now in assets across Europe, working with some of the largest investors on the planet, $1 trillion asset managers and so on. We raised a bit of venture. I think the last round was like 100 million Series B. We didn't really need more money than that, because the business sort of is a very high margin business and an AUM business as well, similar to running a fund. It's been very, very interesting. I think building it out over 7 years, the business sort of continues to do really well. They've scaled across Germany, Spain, and the UK. I'm more in an advisory capacity now as opposed to an operating capacity. But that's sort of another one close to my heart, which has done quite. The team continues to make me proud.
How did you discover this? It's a fairly niche kind of a segment that there are private equity, retirement funds, pension funds, etc., who want to hold assets, and they can hold residential assets, and they'll need a company that will help them acquire these assets. Like that, that's so different from what you were doing previously. How did you discover the space?
Yeah, it's a great question. Two things. One is, look, the pain point for, let's say, a Blackstone or a PGIM or any of these players, Teachers Insurance, that's one of the largest asset managers, right? The challenge for these guys is, how do I deploy 500 million in German real estate, right? It's not possible today because, as said, cities have grown organically. Any new development opportunity is going to be in tier 4 locations. Any existing stock might come online, but it'll be very distressed, right? So not easy to take care and fix. And they come in maybe once in 5 years. So it's very hard to invest programmatically or at will into these asset classes. The only way to do that is to go direct to consumer and buy one by one by one by one by one. So that's essentially what we built, very similar to the cars sourcing machine, which I had sort of helped build. If you remember, we were able to build a direct to consumer brand. Hey, we can give you an incredible transaction, super smooth, super easy. Everything's taken care of. We'll come in, we'll do with the app, all the data in. Using the app, we're able to sort of predict the pricing as well, give you a confirmed offer. Your documents will be read automatically as well. Everything's sort of done. So I think it was a very similar consumer experience. Number one. So I think for us that was the learning that I had from Cars24 really came in handy. I think several of the investors that have backed Cars24 have also been a part of the journey at IMMO. So there was that continuity as well. People believed in us, people believed in me and the team. I had common friends with my co-founder, and we started jamming while I was still in India. And we actually set up the company before I even left for the UK, because we were so excited about the opportunity. We got our first client before I landed in London, but it was just from there it was just as they say, it's been a wild ride since that point on. But a lot of it came through similar learnings. That in a supply constrained market, cannot access supply, very complex transaction, lots of pain point, probably one of the largest categories you could play in, right? It's $1 trillion market in Europe. So I think the TAM played a big part as well in the choice for that particular category in the asset class.
I'm assuming your friend would have had access to the PE and pension fund space to get buyers and generate demand for this.
Exactly. So they
Uh,
come from sort of Blackstone and JPM and
okay,
Goldman.
got it.
So that's the background. So that's how the connection also worked. I was sort of able to build out the supply and the business, and they were able to build out the capital, the demand side.
You said that the US market has an asset class called SFR, which Europe does not have. Um, what does it mean to have an asset class? Are you talking of that this is a regulated, recognized asset class? There is some regulatory authority, or there is some credit rating agency, or something like that. What does that mean to have an asset class? Because SFR as an asset exists in both these markets, right? We're just saying that for an investor, that asset class exists in US but not in Europe. So that's what I'm trying to understand.
Of course. No, look, I think it exists in different forms. And so in the US, you'd have your REIT structures, which are your real estate investment trusts, which sort of consolidate them and sort of float in the markets, and people can trade them. So that does exist, but specifically and uniquely, you've got a lot of large players, and Blackstone did this post the GFC crash, where there were thousands of properties that sort of went. Defaulted on the subprime loans, and they went and essentially consolidated them, bought them at discounts, and created the largest Invitation Homes, it's called, one of the largest landlords in the US, over 100,000 homes. Back then, floated on the markets, and that did exceptionally well. And then post that, I think another 100 players have done a very similar approach. The challenge with all of these plays, however, is that you're waiting for a big market correction, and you're essentially, I don't mean to say taking advantage of a unfortunate situation, right? Whereas we believed in something very different. That's why we're trying to build more of a socially responsible, ESG heavy play, where the returns were sustainably good long term for investors, and the hold was both the returns of both capital and income, rental income. And we can do it programmatically, unlike the US, where it's essentially happens basis some corrections in the market. I think the more recent players have started to use a bit more technology. There's a few players that are doing it now in the US as well, but Europe does not have that, right? So again, as I mentioned, any large institution still finds SFR, unlike the US, in Europe, they still find it new and risky, even though it's the most, if you will, most risk adjusted, best return asset class out there, because it's so new, right? So they don't know how to do it. And the difference, obviously, is Europe, US, you have a little bit more standardization in kind of the stock. The country sort of has standard regulations across the different states as well. There's a certain level of mobility existing, whereas in Europe you can have, it's like each country is its own regulatory challenge. So you also have to sort of be conscious of which ones you're going after. So those are some differences, I would say, between the US, and that's why it's been hard for any player to, private equity or otherwise, to really build a large exposure across Europe. And we were uniquely able to provide that across different regions in not just one country.
Okay, interesting. So essentially, when you say US has this as an asset class, it means there is a lot of institutional capital already, or a lot of assets under management already in this asset class. Um, I am not able to remember the name, but there was a competitor to Zillow which had this similar approach in the US of programmatically buying houses, which
Open
I do
door,
believe
open door.
shut down. Open Door,
Yeah,
right?
open door. Yeah.
Open Door, and they shut down. I believe I
Yes, they
could be
have.
wrong. I remember reading
Yes.
something about that. I remember Zillow also had a programmatic buying of houses program in the US, which they shut down. Um,
Yes.
so
Why
I
did
don't
that not
know.
work? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Why did that not work, and why did it work for IMMO?
Yeah. So I think the difference is largely the open door model was a C2C transaction business. So they were buying directly from consumers and then selling back to consumers. The challenge, as we discussed earlier, going back to the cars example, is inventory. So if you are buying from consumers and you don't have an instant sale already guaranteed on the other side, you're holding stock on something that you don't know what the real value of that asset is. And in some cases, and I'm not pointing fingers at the company here in Open Door, but in some cases, what you can do is in the mad rush for growth, you don't really have controls around the actual investment thesis. The way we were operating, I would say very differently, is because we would set the criteria with professionals that knew how to invest in real estate, that had certain targets for their funds. They knew what they were looking for, and we'd build the strategy with them, and then we'll go crazy within those bounds. So you can scale very fast, right? And we are deploying at 1.5 billion a year sort of rate, right? We're doing very, very fast acquisitions, almost a billion actually at one point. But the thing is that always happened within the bounds of the thesis. So the way we had built it out is we would scout the market for 8,000 properties, let's say across the 3 cities at that particular point in time that the investor has a target defined as, and we'd identify the top 9 properties in that week that actually were extremely, superior in terms of returns, in terms of stability, in terms of, because we'd be looking at, 200 pages of data, and we'd be able to identify the risks within that property, whether the elevator has a problem, whether the roof has a problem, whether there's mold issues. We could identify that. So the ability for us to make a decision is significantly more confident because the asset is already sold as the moment it gets bought, if that makes sense, because it's rolling into an SPV structure,
That
a
makes all
company
the
structure.
difference. Right. Yes, that makes. I do believe the Open Door shut down because of inventory problem. The inventory they had lost value, and they got wiped out because of that. Whereas you did not hold inventory. You would start a search when you got a mandate from a buyer. So it was the other way around. Okay, very interesting. Okay, um, how do these screening and evaluation, how does that happen? You have like some assessors who come in and are paid per assessment, and that then gets converted into a machine readable format, or like how does that happen?
No. So we actually had people that were largely very good at technology. They were very good at, of course, they had qualifications in real estate surveying. It's called surveying, but people that did not have 40 years of experience, right? These are people that had 3 to 7, 8 years of experience, that had done technically very strong on the actual asset assessment, but they were able to use the technology we were offering. They knew exactly what the information has to be. We're collecting, I said, over 250 data points. Where's the fireplace in the property? How does the flow of the rooms work? Using the app, they're able to detect the ceiling heights. They're able to detect the size of the windows. That made a big difference. They were able to detect the age and the probability of lead and asbestos in the property. They were able to assess using that, what reconfiguration could be done to unlock value, as I mentioned in the cars example as well. If you move the kitchen from here to here, it unlocks an additional room, etc., etc. So a lot of that literally happened with the data collection. So everything sort of went back to the app, which is driven at that point by machine learning. Now we're sort of using much more AI to read a lot of the data, both both video, static, and sort of input. Once that data would go in real time, within seconds, we were able to actually create an underwrite. It's called an underwrite of a property that would take the same amount of diligence that a Blackstone would do, for example, on a $100 million investment, we would be doing for a 100K investment. So it'd be a 20-page report underwrite with comparables, with sort of all the risks, with a debt servicing ratio, everything included. Would be created instantly. And this is why, from an investor point of view, they initially started with investing. It was crazy. They were investing 200, 300K deals or 2-3 crore deals on WhatsApp. Completely crazy how we started. And then sort of moved into discretionary buying, where once they set the parameters, they would only review it with us every quarter to understand how the portfolio expansion is going, and then make adjustments. So it became discretionary buying on behalf of large institutions because of how robust the underwriting and the AI sort of evaluation methods were.
Okay, fascinating. Um, so You said that this is an AUM business. How is it an AUM business? You're buying and you're flipping properties, right? It's a trading business, from what I understand.
No, no. So we don't flip. So again, the beauty in this model is, again, if I'm taking Blackstone example, not because we love them, of course, but not because there's no other examples out there, just for simplicity. If I'm a Blackstone, now I have invested $350 million into German real estate with IMMO. I'm going to be handed 1,250 keys. Now, as an investor, that I don't know how to operate this. I have no way to actually take that on, do the renovation, refurbishment, and do the management from a rental point of view. I can't do it. It's impossible. It's a distributed portfolio, right? So that's obviously the one risk they felt existed. Now the beauty is this is actually not a risk, because when they understand that they immediately got it, is like if you buy a building with 1,000 or whatever, 3 buildings with 1,000 units each, with a total 1,000 units. The problem actually that you carry there is there's this called concentration risk in real estate, right? Things could change. The way that the nearest metro station or tube station was supposed to come up does not happen, or permissions get delayed, or the building permissions don't come through, or the labor sort of shortages start to appear, which is happening, or issues such as the tenancy is poor because there's a new upcoming area, right? So it's a very concentration risk. What we actually were able to offer was obviously a distributed, sort of diversified portfolio across the city, and this is in many ways a dream for an institution, right? An institution like a large pension fund, like a private equity, they're looking for a diversified portfolio always. They're investing into the middle class of, let's say, Frankfurt in Germany. We were able to give them that, but they can't now take on that diversified portfolio and operate it. So we essentially took it on, did the renovation. We were able to then, so again, asset light, we didn't own the assets here, and then manage it on their behalf, which is where you'd essentially get a percentage of the rental income, property management, and long-term gains in the portfolio as well. So it's a pretty insane, to be honest, business model. 70% plus gross margin, 75% gross margin business. So almost like a SaaS business, but in the real world, if that makes sense.
So essentially, like Blackstone would put in money into an SPV, and you would be managing those assets, and therefore this was an AUM business. You would be responsible for maintenance, rent collection, finding tenants, the whole 9 yards around. The- like Blackstone is purely looking at it as a financial asset, nothing more. The operations is with IMMO.
Exactly. So they don't want to operate it. So we would essentially do the renovation, upgradation, the renting out, the management of the documentation with the councils, all of that, painful operational work. But what it obviously gave us is the moat, the defensibility that once you're in with that client, it's very hard for them to now find another person that can do the acquisition and the operations, right? So you either get one or the other. You'll get brokers or agents, and even large players like JLL, CBRE, that would be doing the brokering of the assets. But then you have to find somebody else now to do the management of the assets. And given that it's so distributed, even though it's beautiful from an investment thesis and investment management point of view, returns are pretty extremely good. Like we were generating in some assets, in some portfolios, above 18 to 20% IRRs. Which typically in European real estate, I mean, if you get 6 or 8, you're lucky. So it's very good in returns for an asset class that is the most, if you will, risk averse, low risk asset class as well, and long term holds. Like is exactly what they're looking at. So it's predictable returns. Think of yourself as a pension fund. I would say even like some of our clients are like very large insurance players, like pension funds, like $1 trillion under management. For them, they don't people working there don't get fired because or they don't get promoted just because they make 1% extra return. They get fired if they lose the money. So for them, really investing into safe long-term asset classes is a wet dream, right? And that's what we were able to offer them.
Okay, fascinating. And you would be paid like a margin from what money was being generated, or was it a fixed fees, or how was that structured?
Of course, I love the incisive questions here. We were. I will send you the PNL right after this. No, we were able to get a percentage of the transaction value. So like a brokerage for making sure the acquisition happened. We were able to generate a percentage of the mortgage, so the credit side of it, which is because the way this makes sense is at that point, and now slightly less so. Interest rates were pretty bonkers, right? It was like 0.6% fixed for 10 years in Germany at 100% LTVs. In fact, 110% LTCs as well is what we're getting. So from a equity utilization point of view, and the leverage is to the moon. So lots of really huge upside for, I would say, for clients. So you would get the mortgage side as well. Then you would get a percentage of the actual renovation, so the asset management fee, the asset upgradation fees. Then we would get a percentage of the rental income. We would get a percentage on top of property management and sort of the actual reporting of it, the portfolio management. And in some cases, we would also get carry from a portfolio, right? So as I mentioned, that's sort of why it's almost like running a fund. But we would have no cost because the only cost we actually had was our own staff. Everything else essentially paid for by the SPV, by the company.
Wow, fascinating. This is like extremely cash flow, like healthy cash flow kind of a business. There's so many places where you're making margins. Why would you ever want to leave this? I mean, this sounds like to become a
Yeah, this
multi-millionaire.
this was the retirement plan, right? This was the plan. I was done, right? And that's what my wife is like. The reason she hates me, well, for many other reasons. One of the reasons she hates me is because I cannot sit still in buildings. The company's built now. We've got an insane machine. We've got like a pipeline of capital that's billions in demand. We've got 150 million in the bank. It's like, what are we doing, right? So just keep executing. Let's retire. But two things happened. So one is my colleague, this is 32-year-old lawyer, Oxford grad, extremely smart. She was like one of the warmest people and one of the smartest people I know. She got cancer in London, so she got leukemia, stage 3. Sort of went through 5 months of chemo at one of the top hospitals in London, and she beat the cancer, so she was done. So we thought. This was 22, late 22, early 23. There's all these doctor strikes happening in the NHS, the nurse strikes, and workforce issues, and blah blah blah. And she was asked to vacate her bed, hospital bed, right? And she's asked to go into a social care facility where there's a different setup, not clinical, but at least there's oversight and there's nurses, and they didn't have the workforce either. So they said, we can't take you. So she was sent home, right at the point where she's probably at the lowest that she can possibly be in her life. This is happening. This is 8 to 10 weeks. There was almost no clinical, medical sort of oversight. And in a system that's obviously public sector, very different from India, one would argue. You can pay for a service. She didn't get any. And 2 days before it happened, I was texting with her, and it's completely bizarre, right? Out of the blue. We're like all preparing for her to come back to the office and so on. She basically got a lung infection and passed away. So after she beat the cancer, after she was done, after we expected her to come back, she lost her life to in this case, the NHS. And I've lived in the UK in the 90s. I've seen what the system was capable of, and I've seen what has happened to it. And my CTO shared the same story, having worked in Germany at a pre-IPO fintech. He was sort of head of engineering for one of the largest banks in the US as well, and used to work with us at IMMO as CTO. He described his experience of this brought out memories for him because they lost their baby in the German healthcare system at one of the top hospitals in Europe, the number one hospital in Germany, and top 3 in Europe, because they were waiting in the waiting room for 6.5 hours, and nobody came, and the wife was in pain, and she could have died on the operating table. Like she was lost so much blood, but they couldn't save the baby. And for them, it became, again, it's for him also, it's super personal, right? It's just not everybody understands this side of what's going on, right? There's a complete and utter breakdown of the healthcare systems at this point in time. And one of the biggest reasons, and this is sort of what really opened up my eyes, is like the shortage of workers is just astronomical, right? You're talking about almost 85 million people short in the global north. Out of that, almost 20 million coming from healthcare and old age care and social care shortages, and it's only getting worse because the economies are getting older and older and older, right? I was just on a call with one of my clients in Japan now. It's like 50-year-old average age now in Japan. 50 years is the average age in Japan, right? Um, Replacement rates are down, right? So fertility rates are down. There are not enough babies coming. It's 0.9 to 1.3 versus 2.1 to stabilize the population. And the youth that is graduating don't want to do these jobs because these are hard jobs, right? A 75-year-old dementia patient, right? First day on your job, throwing feces at you is not what this generation is signed up for, right? They would rather park $25,000 in Bitcoin and sit on it, right? That's they're very happy with that. Or they drive a delivery truck and deliver groceries. They're happy. Like, it's just not an aspirational job. It's in the rural areas, in small towns where there's older people. They don't want to go there. So these towns, these villages are getting deserted, right? So there's a massive problem on this side. So Germany, the UK, Japan, US, Canada, it's a lot of it, very, very similar shortages, right? At the same time, I sort of came across and I started to, we have a nanny in London, right? This girl called, girl from Gujarat in Ahmedabad. She's an operating theatre nurse, right? Her dream was to work in the NHS, the exact same problem I just talked about. And she found an agent to help her get that job. He paid that guy, paid that guy, paid that guy, paid that guy, kept paying that guy. They had to sell their family house. The father had to sell the house so that they could pay the 50 lakh rupees required to get her to the UK. Right? She comes to the UK and realizes the job is fake. There is no NHS job. And she's screwed because now how do you complain? The moment you complain, your visa is invalid because it's currently in a payroll scam. They pay the money, she pays the money back, and that keeps the visa going. Complain, she's out of a job, she's out of the country, right? Or fake job, whatever. And there's a reason this is happening, right? Because you've now got one of the largest oversupply emerging, right? In our country of India, 1.4 billion people, right? 105 million of them are either stealth unemployed or extra unemployed, and women have essentially opted out of the workforce. 100 million of them have opted out. I'm not even including them right now, right? So it's crazy. So there is this aspiration / desperation to be able to find employment. And of course, a lot of good work is happening at a national level, at a state level. We're seeing it. Like I'm working very closely with the ministries in different states. But it's not enough because there's not enough employment to be had we cannot absorb that many people. So you've got one of the biggest oversupplies emerging. India has, I don't know if you know this, like we've doubled our capacity for nurses in terms of nursing college seats and medical college seats in the last 5 years. We've doubled it. Right? So this is where the problem became very apparent. You've essentially got a fragmented supply of talent in markets like India and Africa, Central Asia, Philippines, Latin America. India being one of the, I would say, the most well-positioned, but also poorly positioned in a different way. One of the biggest oversupplies emerging, while you've got the biggest shortage that we have ever seen in skilled workers on the planet. It's happening at the same time. So the obvious answer here was, could I now look at this problem as it all started happening in front of me, over the last period of building IMMO? I'm like, financial upside aside, this has to be solved. Like there is no chance that we can allow citizens of our country, and to go through these 6 or 7 layers, and people are essentially being sent to the front lines in Russia because these kids are so desperate to find a job, and they're saying, look, at least if I die, my family is fed. This is happening in present day India, right? There's a reason why movies like Donkey are being created. So I think the government is doing a very good job in trying to clamp down and actually create more ethical systems. But the reality is, the informal sector is so large and so driven by profit and driven by money that, and the other flip side of this, think about it. You get a job tomorrow at Google in India. and the headhunter comes to you and says, okay, I got you this job, now pay me 25 lakh rupees. Makes no sense. Why is the burden of revenue on the talent? Makes no sense. And this is how the category operates today. So we've essentially flipped the script and said, look, the employers have to pay, right? It is not about, so it's again a C2B model, right, as we described. So constrained supply, you know, demand that is really, really, really desperate, but also slightly disorganized, not really modern, and connecting those two. So we've essentially built an AI platform that does everything from the first phone call, including counseling, by the way, to a WhatsApp document and data gathering, credentialing, verification, to the actual 30 to 60-minute video interview. All of it happens on AI. Right? We of course got a team that is supporting in terms of counseling, relationship, training, language, etc. But all of this platform is essentially built on AI. So as an employer, let's say NHS Birmingham, right? I don't need to go through the 6.5 lakh people in the TERN database. I can just look at, the 8 people that are pediatric nurse qualifications, that have the NMC exam done, that have the language, they have the technicals, they have the visa documents, and they are a 90% plus fit for that particular role, and they have gone through the interview process already, right? And I can pick them up and I choose 7 of them, and that's what's happening today, right? We've got 90%, 88% conversions from receive to offer, right? And once that's done, the entire supply chain on logistics of visa, immigration, arrival, post-arrival support up to 6 months, all of it, housing, credit, if you remember, a lot of that coming back again, is supported, provided to the individual so that they have a soft landing into the country and are able to integrate well into their new home. So this is what we've built, essentially if you will, an Amazon for healthcare workers, for nurses, for doctors, for physio, rehab, radiology, dental, blah blah blah. So that's sort of what we've built. And the reason I built it was actually deeply personal. It has nothing to do with money. It has nothing to do with just in terms of financial upside. Is of course is there's enough and more happening. You see a problem, like, and that's the problem with sort of, I think some founders are founders that tend to be obsessed. I got obsessed with the problem, and thankfully it's paid off. We sort of 2 years into the journey, we're growing 40% month on month. The business is doing over 200 to almost 250 crores in revenues, and sort of accelerating fast. And it's because I think the problem is big enough to be solved. I couldn't look away.
This a lot of questions I want to ask. This 250 crore is your ARR or?
Yeah, annualized. Yeah, annualized
Okay.
revenues. This is
Okay. Okay.
money in the bank.
And
Money in the bank. Okay.
so you're saying in about 40 months you've reached a 250 CR ARR?
Yeah, so we're at 24 months now.
24 months. Okay. Amazing. What's your headcount like?
So we're 80 people within the team, largely India based. So I would say 50% India, 30% Germany, and the remaining 20% between the UK and the UAE, Dubai.
And how many people are you moving each month, or like what's the annualized number of people getting immigrated?
So we've helped thousands. We've not sort of talked about the numbers yet publicly, but for a few reasons. I think it's sort of the government's also trying to maintain control over that information politically as well. So we don't talk about the exact numbers. It's largely into Germany. So I would say our business is 60% Germany, again 30% in the 25% UK and 15% roughly into the GCC region. We've done a bit of pilots in Japan and the US now, which we're sort of expanding into soon. But yeah, it's in several thousands today. Less than 10,000, but above
So
1,000.
in a month, it would easily be like a 3-digit number per month.
Yeah. So exactly. So in some months it's been 2 digits last year, and some months it's sort of closer to 3 digits now. Yeah.
Okay. So how do you do so much with such a small workforce? Because we're talking of 100 people moving each month, and you need to give them certain amount of hand holding. and you need to also, possibly there could be training requirement. If you're sending people to Germany, I doubt you'll find German speakers in India, so that language training would be needed. Maybe etiquettes, whatever, like it's very different in the West in terms of etiquettes and soft skills, so I'm sure that soft skills etiquettes polishing is needed. And then with the soft landing, everything that you're doing over there, how are you doing it with such a small workforce?
Yeah. So I think this is the difference between sort of companies built pre 2022 and post 2022. I think for us, we're an AI native company, right? So what I mean by that is literally every single team member either has to learn to do their tasks with AI or basically not be here, right? So it's a very clear mandate to the team, whether it's marketing, whether it's supply, whether it's training, whether it's operations. Every single step of the value chain essentially has to be run with AI, right? And for us, that was a very clear intention from the beginning because I did not want to build a 10,000 people company again that was doing a billion in revenues, right? I mean, to me, it makes no sense because the dollar ARR per FT metric, which is where the world is going, is abysmally poor then, right? So our goal is to get to $1 million per FT. Let's say if you can get that, pure tech companies are coming out of the valley, which are doing sort of two people companies generating 100 million. So we'll get there. I'm pretty sure we will also do our level best. I think, but it's not about getting to that number. I think it's more about the intent and how you build. And the reason is I think the marginal cost of dev is heading to zero, right? So the way you build companies now do not need to be, okay, now I have got this idea, and 6 months later, the tech team will have some capacity to build it. It'll take another 3 months. We're building it on the fly, right? Our product teams are essentially, and this is where it's very interesting, the ratio of product to tech in the past has always been 1:8, 1:12, 1:10. That's been the ratios. The ratio we are moving towards is 1:0.5. I want one product manager for every zero point 0.5 engineer, right? I'm not taking engineers out of a job, right? The best ones, the elite ones will always be working with us. But I mean, even if you don't get to 0.5, 0.9, we're 1.1. The point is, it's really the different way of building companies, and it's starting now, right? The way that compounded companies are getting built as opposed to single product companies, right? As I mentioned, marginal dev cost going down to zero. Even if I need to build a product that is doing phone calling to the customer, right, or talents, I will never do it with a human at this point. The humans will do it to learn, and then they themselves, so the team themselves start to build stuff, right? And then they're obsoleting that particular topic, right? We've essentially moved it so far up the funnel, right? Similarly on training, language training you mentioned. So don't we actually did run German training classes, and we continue to run some German training classes. It takes sort of 9 months to get people to B2 level, which is sort of equivalent to speak fluently in a profession like nursing. But what we started to experiment with was AI facilitators, right? So the constraint there for, let's say, a market like Germany is not going to be people willing to learn German, right? The challenge is, are there enough German teachers? Can you create enough German teachers fast enough? And that's not something within my control, right? That's a capacity foundational problem. So can we fix it in a different way? Okay, we said, okay, instead of a 1:10 ratio between teachers to student, how do we get to 1:100? How do we get to 1:1000, right? So my co-founder comes from EdTech. He sort of built one of the more successful impact spaces. It's a company called Avanti Fellows, sort of did distance learning, partnered with Harvard, sort of, social entrepreneur of the year multiple times in India and global, sort of built urban company in that as well with the team. Abhiraj and the team was part of the leadership there. Built, was load share, chief operating, sort of ran the entire business. Series C company, comes from BCG Healthcare, sort of family is in essentially in, two very famous doctors in India as well. So for us, and for him, the education side of this did make a lot of sense. There's a very clear path on how we would build it out. But for us, the bottleneck was not the teaching. It was really about how do you scale. Bottleneck was the teaching. How do you scale that instruction from 1:10 to sort of 1:100? So that's where we started to use AI. Like you got one. So instead of 420 hours of lessons to get to, let's say, German B1 by humans, you want to bring it down to almost 100 or 80, and then the remaining sort of get filled through AI facilitation and practice sessions. So that's what we built. We have apps where people can be traveling from the hospital to the home and just practicing. It's like a Duolingo for nurses. I mean, that got spun up within a month and a half. Like, it's insane what is possible now, which you couldn't even, like, the constraint is human imagination. The constraint is not dev. The constraint is imagination. So I think for us, that's been, and I was presenting to one of the governments recently, because we're sort of in certain projects, we're competing with very large players like Palantir now for landing some of these projects as well. And they looked at our product, and this is the chief AI officer of the country, essentially saying, I see tens of AI companies every day, but I've rarely seen something as impressive and as close to human interaction as you guys, as TERN. Um, and my point in all this, it's not about the words. It's really about the depth with which we have gone into building this stack. Right? It's really you especially the interviewing piece and the competency assessment and the actual sort of two-way video interview or underwrite, if you can call it, similar to cars, the underwrite of the person. We have built this with clinicians, with doctors with 15, 20 years of experience. We've built this with nurses that have sort of stayed in head nursing roles, built this with healthcare recruiters. We've built this with people working at Randstad and Adecco and all these wonderful companies, with the AI technologists, the teams, the product guys and the engineers working alongside them, right? And this has taken us over a year to build that particular model. So there's certain models we've gone super deep in because we know this is the version 7 of it, that AI needs to be able to respond under oath in front of a judge, right? That's how robust it needs to be. Because essentially what you're doing there is essentially finding people. This particular country wants us to create this talent quality filter at a national level, not at an operator level. Because they've got people coming from 70 countries to come and work there. And they're saying, if that's happening, this is a national security problem, because I'm unleashing foreign healthcare professionals, as wonderful as they might be, but I don't know what competence they actually have for the requirement of the role in this country on my citizens, right? So for us, this was an eye-opening moment. Like, holy moly, it's not just us solving for ourselves, but actually if we build this correctly, there's a much, much larger play, which is the original mission. Can you create a transparent, new age way of talent finding opportunity, and for countries and healthcare systems to find the best qualified professionals? So this is coming to life now much faster than we had anticipated, because, and I don't know if it answers your question in a very convoluted way, but we've built it AI native.
What are some best practices of making AI products that work? Like one could just go to ChatGPT and give a prompt and say that create an interview bot, and it would create an interview bot, but it would be pretty apparent on the other side that I'm talking to a bot. So what is it that is over and above just a prompt on ChatGPT to create a good quality AI product?
Of course, no, I love that. So I think I'll tell you what we are doing, and I don't know if it's best practice. It is our practice. It's our practice. So I think two, three things. One is there is you need to understand. We need to understand that the first 80% is very easy, right? Whether it is dev, whether it is debugging, whether it is design, whether it is legal opinion, whether it is interviewing AI. There's 1,000 AI recruiters out there. I mean, honestly, you go out there, you search online, you'll find 1,000 AI recruiters, right? The point is not, or interviewers. The point is not to find somebody that can mimic a human conversation or can ask smart questions. The point is really in the tuning, right? Is the specialization. I'll give you an example. So the reason why this particular government is so excited about working with us and building this out for them is, like, we've gone into the detail of having 80 different specializations of nursing, right? And being able to create an agent associated with each of them, right? We are able to assess 28 different attributes for each individual specialization across hard skills, soft skills, communication, empathy, leadership, ability to learn, blah, blah, blah. And if you take a three-dimensional matrix, then it's also the number of years of experience, right? So I have a 3-year experience, pediatric nurse, which on empathy, right? What is the level of competence and how do you assess it, and how do you? It's really about verticalizing. So the best practice, how we are approaching it, look, if it's a product that is non-core, which means it doesn't directly impact the quality of talent being produced or assessed, and it's an operational sort of product, then we would pick up Bolt or Cursor, and team would go in and essentially just spin up a design and an app, test it out with the internal teams, because largely that's where the client, the customers, all external clients, test it out, learn from them, and then only go into building. So we would never go into building, and the building in that case is essentially the last 20%, ensuring the interoperability, ensuring the infrastructure architecture works, ensuring the data access works, and ensuring it doesn't fall apart in corner cases, right? So that's really what the work happens. But we don't do any of that until we've created some kind of validation for the thing that we've spun up in an hour, right? On one of these products. So we tend to very heavily use some of these products for non-core, I would say, operational efficiency gains. And
I'm assuming this MVP even a product manager could do. You may not even need a dev to build an MVP.
We don't need a dev for that.
So essentially, that's why you have more product managers, because you want to tell your product manager, if there's a problem to solve, create an MVP, and if that MVP works, then your dev will convert it into an actual feature in the product.
Exactly. So I think the approach there is really looking at, I would say, very high caliber product folks that are coming from founder backgrounds, because you're not. So the product role essentially is a founder CEO role, right? That's literally my job. Like I cannot delegate it to anybody either, right? But having said that, you need people that think and behave like founders in those roles, because now the product role is going to become the most critical role in any company. Any tech company, the product role is going to be the most critical role, largely because they will be mini CEOs building out their stacks by themselves, figuring out with consumers by themselves, and launching by themselves with sort of, obviously elite engineers to help out on the actual implementation, scaling, architecture side, right? And the final 5%, if you will. But the product role is becoming so central, and I don't think it's ever happened in the history of tech this much. That, and it used to be a thing. It was never a thing back in the day. There was the business and there was the tech, and then the product managers came along and became consultants, and all sort of wonderful, smart people. But they do not actually have many times the real world building experience. So for us and for me, it's been very clear a choice that these have to be founders that are very curious, that have built products before, that know how to iterate fast, that have full ownership over the stack. So it's not like 5 layers of product managers now, right? It's literally the one person. We only have one person per business unit or per stack, and they do everything, right? And there's no confusion as to them sort of now jumping in here, jumping there. They have 4 layers of people sort of doing small. No, you don't need that anymore. You need to have very high quality. I think very similar to engineering as well. The direction of travel is going to be more and more sort of engineers that can do the final 20% versus the first 80. And yeah, I don't know if that helps, but that's sort of how we.
That's best practices on product development. What about so that's more on the development side, but you said verticalization is key. It is possible to verticalize using AI. So for example, you can give a prompt and say that create manuals for pediatric nurse, and then feed that to create the agent. Is that how you do it? Does the verticalization also happen with AI giving training data to the agent which is getting created, or like?
Yeah, no, I love the idea, and I'll probably use it in some way. Thank you for that. And I'm not paying you for it. I'll probably pay you for it over dinner. Look, there's 3 or 4 areas of how verticalization can happen faster, right? So one thing, as I mentioned, is having interview agents that can, so one, creating synthetic data and then feeding into this one with a human in the loop. Without the human in the loop, you're creating a completely irrational outcome. Potentially there's a very dangerous outcome possible. Again, operating in healthcare, operating in categories that are dealing with patients directly, we carry a very huge responsibility to make sure these agents and AI products are built correctly, with a level of depth that, as I mentioned, they can be under oath in front of a judge and they will give the same answer, right? That's an extremely hard thing to do, as we all know. If you've tried asking ChatGPT the same question on 5 different days, right? Things do change, right? So what I mean by verticalization is if you're creating synthetic data, so let's say there are 20 attributes. There's a male doctor with oncology with 18 years of experience with some Arabic language and English, and has degree from, I don't know, UK, MRCP, blah, 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 blah. There's 20 attributes. That synthetic data of that individual can be created by an agent saying these are the answers this person would give. That answers have to be fed into the next agent that's going to assess it with a human in the loop to fine tune it. Right? So these are very important. You cannot miss these steps. The moment you miss this step, you've essentially created an infinite recursive loop. And I'm oversimplifying here in terms of explanation, which you don't know where it'll end up. The hallucinations will basically compound. Right? That's a problem. Right? So that's one of the things that we've been very intentional about. That's why I'm saying we have a team of clinicians. A clinical AI team essentially does only this. Their job is to look at the data, the output coming in, tune it, and feed it back. Right? And which is why we're being approached by sort of some of the larger foundation labs now, the AI labs, to do the verticalization for their foundation healthcare models as well. So without naming names, that's the one, because we have access to a database that people don't really have access to, right? If you need a internal medicine specialist with 12 years of experience, can also speak Arabic, they don't exist. We have to essentially use our database to recruit them. So we have actually now moving beyond the general sort of data labeling like company like Scale AI to now verticalized and deep. And that's where I think our database is also coming in super handy. Some of the stuff we're doing is actually very, very interesting in that space of helping foundational models get built in the US and other markets.
You said there were a bunch of ways in which verticalization happens. One is synthetic data with human in loop. What are the other ways?
Yeah. So the other ways that we are looking at verticalization is user, right? Is the interviews that are coming out without sort of having personally identified information because of GDPR. We're essentially able to take a lot of that real data coming in, the interviews that are really happening, using that to continue to improve the models. Compare that with notes in terms of how did the actual client or the HR person review that particular person, adjust accordingly, and then keep improving. Take feedback from the hey, you did not rate this correctly. I was so shocked recently where I actually hired for a role for myself, which was like a founder's office hire. We got over 400 applications, 105 of them extremely good. On paper, I would hire each one of them extremely strong. And we had a version 1, like the clinical version is now version 8 or version 9, right? So we have a version 1 product now on this founder associate that the team unleashed on. And because the rest of it is the same, right? It's basically the same.
So this would be synthetic data with human in loop version 1.
Exactly. Synthetic loop with human in the loop. Synthetic data with human in the loop. Exactly. And we unleashed it upon this set of people. Like 105 people went through the process. Almost no HR interaction, WhatsApp document data gathering, and then the interview process. These are very smart people that have built big tech companies or have been part of very successful outcomes, MBAs from some of the best schools, blah blah blah. And it was so fascinating that I saw somebody that I actually knew the person personally, right? I knew them. So I know the person has an incredible experience in tech and consulting and sort of worked in various countries, in Southeast Asia, Middle East, Europe, India, and big brand name, right? So, and that person got a 6.2 out of 10. And I'm like, this doesn't make sense. Something must be wrong, right? So either he did not complete the interview or the questions were asked poorly, blah, blah, blah. And then I went through the actual interview myself, right? So because it's recorded, so I went through the 20-minute interview. I realized that the context was answered, the outcome was explained, and the business impact was explained. They did not explain the actions in any of the answers, the 5 questions that they'd given. And in my head, I'm thinking, oh wow, that's a pretty superficial answer. Right? I mean, is not for a person that experience and that quality of work should have gone in depth. I kid you not. That was exactly the words written in the AI interviewer response, right? So what the AI recruiter had responded with, for somebody with that level of experience and that sort of variety, they should have been able to go in depth, and the answers are very superficial. Literally the same words that came to my mind. So I'm like, and this is version 1. So for me now, we are finding that for clients, the recruiters we've built are actually going beyond what HR can ask. We're able to ask questions at a clinical level that a doctor would potentially encounter in their life. So we're having to dumb down a little bit of our interviewing to not sort of eliminate some very high quality people also, or high quality people also. So yeah, that's sort of the other approach, is to use live user data.
So, the what light this throws on future of work is two things. One is that there is a high chance that what you are doing today, if it can be transcribed, then you can be replaced. Any action which can be transcribed means you're replaceable. So be it interviews or whatever, be it education, if it can be transcribed, then it can be fed to a model, and the model can be trained on it, and you can be replaced by a model. And the second insight this gives me is that a lot of work then is going to be more about quality. Like if you are replaced by a model, what is the quality level of the model, and being able to understand how to improve that quality is really what AI skills are all about, right? Like what you want to hire for is people who can look at what a model is doing and say, this is shit, we need to improve it, and should also know how to improve it.
Exactly. And I think it's a very obvious thing. I think the way we are looking at it, and at least I look at it, is that AI is not replacing humans, but AI is replacing humans that don't use AI.
Hmm.
If that makes
Absolutely,
sense, right?
yeah.
And I think the reason why this is so important to remember, and I keep reminding the teams, we keep reminding our nurses, we keep reminding our clients as well, the same thing is, it's not coming, it's here, right? It's like the internet came about, and people still do not know how to sort of use and browser, and are stuck. Like this is bigger than the internet. This is bigger than the internet and faster. The way it's on a daily, weekly basis, the amount of progress we are finding in models is just completely off the charts, right? So, and if you still don't operate in an AI native era, right? By the way, I don't have any sort of assistant, scheduling, anything that happens. And obviously my life is very chaotic. I'm sort of all over the place. I have four different tools, AI tools, that I use for AI, for email management, for scheduling, for literally a lot of my prioritization, my traveling, different tools, right? Currency management, I do a lot of that. So I just think you almost have to get into that zone that now I have to start using the internet. Now I have to start using the internet. And for us, it becomes so comfortable right now with whatever we've been doing that we don't think about it. But the reality is it's here already. So AI is not going to replace the human intention. It will replace the human that doesn't use AI. Right. So that's for me would be the one big sort of, and people far smarter than me have said something very
What are
similar.
the tools
So
that you're using? I'm curious.
I'm trying out a few very different products. I love Granola. I think it's one of the
Yeah,
most
I've heard a lot of people talk about Granola. Yeah.
it's one of the most
Granola is
remarkable
like the
note
constant
takers.
transcriber. It's transcribing everything that you're doing.
Exactly, it's doing it right now. So while we're talking,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
like an
yeah.
always on thing, right?
Right, right.
I love it. It's on my phone. It does the same thing. It's on my it does the same thing on my on this video as well. Video calls, it automatically detects the video call and tells me. I used I've tried Fixer, Fyxer. It's a UK based startup. Obviously, it's sort of a bit more biased there, for email management. So that does sort of a lot of the. So I think after a week, it started to write emails like me. It almost like I would literally start typing and it'll draft it automatically and it'll keep it in there and say, let me know if you want me to send it. And I'm like, yes, please. It is pretty intense. It goes to the point, and this sort of partly spooked me a little bit, but partly very impressed me, was that there was a certain conversation with a board member around, not board, one of our investors, around some number of shares. Right? They were asking that question. It answered the question in number of shares because it identified it in a particular email PDF attachment, and I was like, "Holy moly, is this going too far?" Right? So I don't know. So that's another one I got very excited about.
And so you've told me two ways. One is how product managers use it to create MVP. Second is in terms of data, synthetic data, human in loop, and then comparing with actual recorded performances, etc. Is there anything left in that in terms of verticalization best practices?
Yes, yes. I think the other two, three areas. So there's sort of one additional point, right? And there's sort of branches into two areas. One is, given we operate in the healthcare space and there's a huge amount of responsibility on regulation. So what we end up doing is we end up feeding a lot of the actual regulatory documentation for that particular agent. Let's say for pediatric, there's sort of various boards that we need to be compliant to. If there's a specific country we are addressing, then that country's data from the regulator sort of gets fed into it. And I know it sounds obvious, but it's not, because you would assume that that data is already a part of a AI recruiter, let's say, or AI interviewer, or AI assessor. When it is about pediatric nursing, it's not, right? So you actually have to manually tune it, and add that context, very intentionally. So that's sort of the 3A, if you will. The 3B, I think we are very aware that we are not the experts long term, right? And eventually it will be a partnership with the healthcare systems in this case, right? And so a lot of the work actually gets done with clients wanting a specific kind of prompts. I'll give you an example. So one of the things that came in from a client was, if we hire 3,000 nurses this month using your platform, and we are running a lot of parallel interviews, what if one nurse picked up the questions and shared with the other nurse, and cheating happens? And I'm like, they can't, because the questions will change. But I get your point. So then there is a work that we're doing on proctoring, right? Is cheating assessments, right? Is understanding how the eyeballs are moving, first of all, understanding page refreshes, understanding if the person is basically reading from a script, whether there's the same person that was part of the process has actually attended the interview, if somebody else has attended the interview, and obviously having a curated list of questions being generated for a bank of questions essentially versus singular. So I think there's a lot of that feedback process in verticalization that is super critical, because you might build it in an isolation in a lab, right? But if it's not really going deep enough to levels such as that, customization such as that, I think it's not going to work. And the AI is not going to be strong enough, right? It's not going to work in various applications. So various different systems. So that's something we've learned. And I think the last thing is, fourth one is kind of obvious, but it's also sort of understanding the landscape of how the systems integrations are going to happen. And in some cases, leaving that too late, obviously in enterprise, is going to be a massive issue. That's not real verticalization, that's more implementation, but I'm sharing it out of a context of making what you've built now successful.
Okay, interesting. I want to understand the business of TERN. You said you are competing with Palantir. From my understanding, you are a staffing business, an AI first staffing business. So how are you competing with Palantir?
Yeah, okay, great question again. I need to be mindful what I say, but just on this, right? So I think it's obvious, or maybe not obvious, but I'll explain. Look, we started with a thesis on international mobility. Right? That's what you're solving for. You have a massive information arbitrage, within which a lot of these agents and brokers and experts are playing and taking advantage of both parties. To be honest, it's like the Nike analogy of sweatshops in China. And them saying we don't know and we don't care. No, you do know and you do care, and you are liable if kids are being used in those sweatshops. So it's like the accountability of the supply chain does rest on the eventual employer, or the healthcare system. And so collapsing that supply chain and creating a two-sided platform and a marketplace was an obvious step for us to take, because we needed to build our business, right, which was, as you called it, a recruitment staffing business. Very quickly we realized that there is two things. Number one, there is a cap in the number of people a country is going to absorb on an annual basis, right? So let's say healthcare in Germany, and nurses tends to be the biggest. There's around 40 to 50,000 nurses that are going every year, right? And from a market sizing point of view, and of course that's growing, right? So they'll keep growing to 50, 70, 100K, et cetera, sure. But like from a market sizing point of view, if you think about where the market will correct over the next several years, you might make an average ticket size of, let's say, $5,000 as a platform, or as a, in this case, a broker, AI enabled broker. That meant that you were talking about a total market size in German healthcare of $250 million. Right now, to build a business, and we're not interested to build a company that does 100 million or, let's say, 50 million in revenues, right? Or 10% market share, already very good, right? 25% market share, exceptional. What we're trying to build is a generational company, right? We're trying to build the future of how human mobility happens on the planet, right? That's what we're building. If that's the vision, and to be able to create a staffing player in, let's say, and to do that, you want to have at least a TAM size of 10 billion, right? That's how you would approach it. We started to look at that and said, okay, to get to a TAM of 10 billion, you're essentially having to have 40 country category combinations, right? Roughly 25, whatever, 250 times 40, right? Which means you have to build regulation compliant human mobility operating systems, right? And people behind it for 40 of these. So 8 countries times five categories, which makes sense. I mean, sure, you can do it. That sounds exciting, but I think if you take it one level upstream and say, why don't we now do it at a system level? Why don't we, instead of us doing it one by one for everybody, why don't we do it at a system level and present almost a government level solution or a healthcare system level solution, national level solution? That's where this all started to begin, and we started getting demand from the governments and the NHS systems we are working with, the UAE government we're working with, sort of the German healthcare system we're working with. So why don't you build this at a national level for us? I think that's where I mean by competing with Palantir. Obviously, it's a company that has incredible value created, $450 billion, sort of does billions in revenue from government contracts. But the reason I'm mentioning that is we're actually starting to get involved and compete and win versus players like that as well.
So you are essentially white labeling what you have built and offering it to an NHS for cross-border recruitment or for all recruitment?
All. So essentially, it started with cross-border because that's the toughest one, right? The context is very different. People are coming from different countries. Language levels might be different. But then they pick that up and saying, look, why don't I just assess not just recruitment, but why don't I use the same product to do a workforce assessment of my entire million people workforce that a McKinsey will take 5 years to complete. It'll cost them 150, 200 million. I can do that in a month and a half, 2 months, instead of 5 years at 1/10 the price, right? So I think the way of SaaS is also shifting rapidly towards almost a McKinsey plus Infosys model, right? So given we had built the product, and I'm not saying this is our primary business yet, but it's starting to accelerate quite rapidly, right? And this is potentially one of the very big outcomes that we will see originating from the original sort of engine, which is the international mobility piece.
Do you see this becoming a bigger piece of the revenue pie in a couple of years?
I think so. I mentioned compounded companies before. There's two
What does
theses
that mean?
that
I wanted to ask you that. You said compounded companies previously. I forgot to ask you.
Yeah. So compounded companies, and there's compounding in a traditional sense of 1% more every day. But the way I think about compounded companies is that you have a core central thesis or a core central engine, and around that engine you find concentric sort of circles of value that you're able to create. And because the marginal cost of dev, as I said, is almost going down to zero, previously you would only focus on that core and that's what you're building. But right now, the defensibility of that core is so poor, given the cost of dev is so cheap, or is becoming cheap, that unless you build companies which have those concentric sort of spheres, which are very tightly built around that core and have a lot of synergies, you will essentially be out of business in a couple of years, because that's how fast innovation is moving. So what I meant by compounded companies is having these concentric spheres of value. One of them, in this case, being sort of a B2G or a B2E enterprise platform solution. Another one, which I didn't talk about in the call, that we're very excited about is look, we've got these healthcare systems that were designed post-war in the 1940s. They've not changed at all. in the last 70, 80 years. What if you could build a parallel health system by leveraging now a workforce that you have unique access to globally, which is the world's most talented, upwardly mobile and sort of aspirational workforce, which is Indian healthcare workers, nurses, doctors. What if you're able to build a parallel health system as well? So that's something that we're beginning to experiment with as well, which is essentially an asset light way of a hospital at home model, and really sort of creating a parallel system there. So don't want to confuse you with sort of too much information, but what I mean by compounded companies is exactly that. And the third thing I did mention earlier is essentially AI labs, some of the top companies in the world, requiring a much more a deeper database on specialists in 80 specializations in healthcare, that we have unique access to, and then using that to more and more tune their models. So beyond data labeling, it's the human in the loop, and sort of much more specialized feedback to their models. That's what I mean by concentric sort of spheres. I mean, Nick at Revolut does this beautifully. I mean, he calls it big bets. As we're building a company with a core thesis and a core value prop, and if you're able to build big bets around it, you can actually create outsized returns, like what you're seeing with Revolut being valued at what, 65 billion now, in dollar terms. And that's sort of one thing that I sort of always have an eye on is how much value can we actually unlock, and that can be now possible. As I said at the beginning of our catch up, it's limited by human imagination now. It's not limited by the tech priorities anymore. Much to the dismay and annoyance of my product and tech teams, I think it's more limited by us.
Uh, aren't you doing too much for a 24-month-old company?
Yeah. So I hear you and I agree with you. Look, I think, as I said, the playbook is gone. So I often, I had a chat at the London School of Economics the other day, with a class that was graduating, and the question asked was, what would be one advice you give us as we leave? And my comment to them was, forget whatever you've learned, because when you entered your course and when you exited the course, the world has changed. It is not the same world anymore you're entering. I don't know, Akshay, to be honest. I do know that having experiments that can have $1 billion revenue outcomes is something that I'll keep doing. I may not everybody will get it. Some people will, and that's fine. Those are the people that will come on our journey together as investors and board members. Some won't, and we're fine with that. But I'm not here to build a company that's doing 100 million revenues in 10 years, and it's just in the middle of. It's not a bad outcome, by the way. It's I won't call it a zombie company, but like we're here to truly change how work gets done in the future, and solving for the human mobility. And this is the way that we feel we can, right? And if I can unlock one or two themes, and if we need to carve out companies later on, if we can do other things with it, of course we'll do all of those things. We call it TERN Group for a reason, because I also think the category is so vast, that there's insane amount of upside and value to be built. But yeah, I mean, many of these bets might die out and they might not pan out, and that's okay. I'm fine with that, right? But the ones that will create those multi-billion-dollar revenue companies. So that's really the outcome we're envisioning.
Your ambition is inspiring. Okay, the revenue model is just a pay per hire, or do you have other opportunities also? Like say in IMMO, you had multiple uh, places where you were able to make money. So is that similar here, or is it just, you said eventually it'll be like a $5,000 per hire? Probably today it's higher, I'm assuming.
Yeah. It's close to 10. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So look, I see. It's so interesting, right? I use this phrase, which it can sound crass, but if you understand it, probably you'll get it as well. We're birthing a worker in a new country. That worker did not exist. That baby did not exist. You don't have a baby. You've birthed a worker. The moment you birth a worker, a lot of things happen. That worker needs credit. The worker needs a house to live in. The worker needs services. The worker needs career planning, education. The worker needs food. They need everything, right? Essentially. Now, I'm not saying we tap into everything, or everything is materially important to spend effort on, but some of the bigger, they need to remit money back home. There is a lot of this that actually is very high value, right? So housing is very high value, for example. The career upskilling education, continuous education, language training, etc., is quite high value. There's value around major life decisions like cars and so on. There's decisions of remitting money back home as well. Services there, I don't know. Is there a stable coin linked card? I don't know. Like, just there is a lot of stuff that is starting to open up. We're not acting on all of that. We're starting to experiment here and there. But as you correctly pointed out, and now suddenly they've gone from making 15,000 rupees to 3 lakh rupees a month. So they also have a different sort of requirement and expectation on financial side. So we are seeing those streams opening up. We're finding revenue opportunities there for sure. But I think to us, it's more about value creation, right? So what I want to build there is a perfect counselor, right? So somebody that can, 3 years before they even think about moving, right? They're in final year of nursing college. They should be able to pick up the phone, speak to us on an AI conversation, ask all kinds of questions, and that person, that calling it AI a person, that counselor sort of holds the hand until the person is settled in and in the future as well. So that's, if you build that, then you open up a lot of opportunity of revenue maximization and expansion into services. So yeah, to your point, yes, it's very similar. I would say it's even more than the IMMO case. Yeah, yeah.
Currently, like, are you monetizing the training that you give? Like, say you're teaching people German language, is that monetized, or are there other aspects which are monetized?
So we don't monetize the training. Because we are one of the very few licensed players in Germany, as an example, we also commit to ethical recruitment. And today, the definition of ethical recruitment in Germany includes zero cost recruitment plus zero cost training, and the training essentially being subsidized by the employers on the other side. So it's a working capital situation, but we don't charge. But there are things within that as soon as you start to create a counselor sort of model, there can be a premium plan, there can be a basic plan. There's more credits you get, blah blah blah. On the AI interview prep side, the mock interviews, a lot of this we're not monetizing. We're starting to do some experiments. But honestly, as I said, the burden of cost I don't want to keep on the talents. I want to shift it more and more towards the employers, and I'm actually very happy that that's the way it works in Germany. And it's not true for all markets, but at least some markets have understood that dynamic between the two sides.
You have markets where there is ethical recruitment as a mandate, and they don't expect talent to pay. But then there are markets where, like, say, Middle East, traditionally it's always been the agent charging the talent and not charging the employer, especially for like blue collar, gray collar kind of roles. So do you feel like you'd be able to compete in those markets?
Yeah, no, again, a very, very well researched question. So I think there's a key distinction between, so there's two vectors to consider. One vector is English speaking markets versus language locked markets. That's one vector to consider. The other vector you touched upon a little bit as well is blue collar versus highly skilled. When I say skilled, right? And that's another vector to consider. And the reason I mention is, if you pick up the English speaking markets, let's say the UK, US, Canada, the UAE, Australia, there is the kind of problems being solved needing to be solved there is slightly different. It's an efficiency problem, it's a transparency problem, as opposed to an availability problem, right? So the supply does exist. The supply is super inefficiently sort of distributed. To find that exact person you need out of those, I don't know, 250 applications, is what you're solving for, right? There's a lot of desperation. Nurses will give the exam, doctors will give the exam, but you don't know how to find that one person. So, as I mentioned, that's why it's more of a system level problem as opposed to a staffing or a physical mobility documentation problem, right? It's more about the efficiency of, can the supply meet the demand, right? In a super quick and transparent fashion. Whereas if you come to a market like Germany or Japan, for that matter, or Belgium, Netherlands, you can pick up any market in Greater Europe or even South Korea. It's more of the ecosystem itself. There's not enough supply of German speaking. There isn't there is no country that speaks German out of DACH region, right? So Germany, Austria, Switzerland. So that's also a manufacturing problem as well. So you almost have to create the availability of talent that can speak the language. So there we actually had to get involved in building up our own language curriculums, actually getting, from other countries like North Africa, getting people down to train the nurses and train the teachers in India with our partners, with ourselves, and really build up that ecosystem. And then we sort of do a lot more of the finishing sort of school approach using technology. And similarly for Japan, and there's a product market fit. There's a timing point in this, right? You can't go too early because if people don't really want overseas workers. Now everybody is saying we cannot survive without nurses in this case, or professionals like health skilled professionals like that. So that's the one vector, right? So for us, we are not looking at a market like UAE or the UK or even the US from a supply building point of view. We are looking at it as a systems point of view, which is what I mentioned, where we compete with Palantir now. In the NHS, we're competing with them. In the GCC region, we're competing with them, and we see other sort of English-speaking markets, the US and so on. We find very similar sort of challenge requirements or pain points. When it comes to the I would say the blue collar versus the bit more gray collar skilled labor or soft white collar. We were very intentional that we actually did not go after the blue collar for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think for better or worse, there is a level of the informal sector works to get these people placed in construction, in logistics, in sort of manual labor jobs, maintenance facilities jobs. It works to an extent, but again, the challenge there is more an efficiency problem. So I would say a system solution is much better placed than trying to become another agent. To be frank, the margins also aren't there, right? If you want to do this ethically, the margins don't exist. So what we would rather build is a two-sided marketplace where people can find the employer directly, and they can use the system, go through the AI interview, go through the uploading of documents, and are able to connect with the employers. And that employer essentially being facilitated by the government. So there's a government level filter. That is what I would rather build versus, again, trying to build an agency where margins don't exist and shouldn't exist. I mean, these people are coming from really difficult backgrounds, right? They're not really in place to pay that much shouldn't be paying that much, which they do pay to several operators in the category. Whereas when it comes to skilled labor, specifically around certain markets I mentioned already, the other point to remember is there is a quality filter as well, right? Your education, your technical background. So there's a consistency in evaluation that we can achieve towards the employers, towards the clients, and a fairness that we can achieve towards the talents, right? Whereas in blue collar, in some cases, like real estate, like construction, it can be there's not as much of a difference between where the supply is coming from, what the person's qualification is, for good or bad, right? I'm not saying, we just didn't feel we would add as much value there, given it is the informal sector is working. I do think the system solution is possible, and that's where we would rather spend our efforts on.
How did you crack these government accounts? Like, how did you get an entry into NHS or the German medical system? Was it investor introductions or?
This is fascinatingly weird to explain. No, my board members actually aren't. So we do have some folks that have been sort of part of, as investors, have been part of these systems. So the former chairman of the NHS England is an investor in company. He's sort of been a mentor to me when I set up the company in the beginning. The deputy health secretary, government of UK, the CEO of AXA Healthcare, the chief executive of the Conservative Party in the UK, one of the former health ministers of Germany as well, right? So there's people that have really worked hard on landing right up front and creating sort of interest about this solution. And they are coming to us and saying, if you are successful, you can actually save the country if you do this well. So for them, this is a very personal mission also. Apart from that, I think it's honestly been a lot of following the threads as well. Like, so those intros turn into other intros and so on. And if you remember right up front, I explained sort of coming from a government family, both me and my wife, my father sort of being head of human resources or equivalent at the Indian Railways. a lot of the learnings of how these systems work, how the decisions get taken, how a workforce should be operated. And he's also a PhD in organizational design, literally this topic. He's helped governments of Sri Lanka. He was part of the Air India restructuring before the Tata acquisition. So it's sort of in the blood in a weird way, I think, because that would be dinner table conversations. So I think that's helped, as well, to proceed further and land a lot of these MOUs with governments like Japan and the UAE, and also a lot of state governments actually in India. Some really forward-thinking governments, to be honest, that we're working with.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much for your time, Avinav.